The desert kept its own counsel. By late afternoon, the sky over Red Arroyo turned the color of hammered brass, heat trembling off the flats, cicadas burning their music into the air like nails. Cass McKinnon had been 38 years on this earth, and most days felt longer than they had any right to. Folks in town called him High Cass, on account of his size and the mesa he ran cattle under, but the truth of him lived in the spaces between his words. He talked little, worked long, slept short. The house he'd built with his brother sat on an old caliche rise, where mesquite shouldered the wind and jackrabbits carried the dusk on their backs. His brother was years under the red dirt now. The house stayed. At sundown, Cass set his branding irons back in the shed and washed with a ladle, the water warm as spit. The day had cut new lines at the corners of his eyes. He was reaching for the coffee pot when a sound bled through the heat, 3 small knuckles on a plank door, quick and certain, like a heart that hadn't yet learned fear had a longer stride. He turned and opened. The light behind him framed a little girl thin as a whip and stubborn as a sprout punching up through gravel. Her dress had the desert in it, sun-brittled, hem chewed by thorns. Dust streaked her cheeks. One eye haloed with yesterday's bruise. She couldn't have been more than 7. "They hurt my mama," she said, mouth not quite steady. "She can't get up." She said, "Knock at the biggest house with the bull skull on the fence. That's you, ain't it?" Cass looked past her, no wagon at the gate, no horse. Only nighttime yawning open and the wind standing still before it made up its mind. "Name," he said. "June." The chin lifted with a kind of desert pride that grows when there's not much else to drink. "June Porter. Mama's Ruth Ann. Silas he—" The word caught. "He left her by the wash with the javelinas." Cass felt something old and stubborn move in him, not anger that flares quick and dies, but a slow coal in the gut, the kind you live by when nights are long. He crouched so his largeness wouldn't tower like a threat. "You thirsty, June?" "Yes, sir." "Hez?" He handed her the dipper, watched her not spill a drop, then set his hat low and lifted his rifle without show. "Where?" She pointed east, where the land gathered itself into broken shale and Ocotillo spines, where the Cometa Wash cut its dry vein through the flats. "By the cottonwood with the lightning scar," she said. "Get inside," Cass told her, voice leveled by a life of storms. "Sit by the cool of the stove. Don't touch the blue jar lie. Eat a biscuit if you see one." She didn't move, like a quail deciding whether the shadow meant hawk. He reached into his pocket and brought up a horse he'd whittled last winter, meant for no one in particular. He set it in her palm. "For when the wind is loud," he said. June squeezed it and stepped in, as if the door were a threshold she was allowed to cross, only because he said so. Cass shut the heat out behind him and walked toward the eastern dark. The desert let him pass, as it lets anything pass that moves with respect. He cut through greasewood and white rocks that remembered oceans. The wash lay ahead, its bed cracked like old knuckles. Coyotes had written their night language there. The cottonwood stood a little left of center, bearing the story of an old storm down its trunk. He smelled whiskey first, then blood dried to copper. Silence rode both. She lay where the shadows bunched, one arm crooked under her ribs as if to hold them in. A woman in the shape of a life being cut down smaller. Cheek split, lip swollen, dress torn where a hand had not been gentle. There was a rope burn around one wrist, the skin angry and raised. But the eyes, brown and unfixed, were not asking the world for pity. They were appraising whether the world meant to do worse than had already been done. Cass knelt without pushing air around like he owned it. "Ruth Ann Porter," he said, because names steadied things that wanted to unravel. She breathed once, thin and short. "He's gone to drink," she said. The voice held rasp and sand. "He will tell it wrong." "Oh, he'll tell it loud," Cass said, the corner of his mouth hardly moving. He eased his arms under her, and in that motion he switched from man to shelter. She sucked a breath that hurt her to take. He stood with the ease of a habit that had carried cattle from bog and men from worse. Her head found the hollow under his collarbone, as if someone had told her once that was where a chest was quiet. "Child?" she asked. "At my place," Cass said. "Water in her." He carried her across the wash, and the land gave him a path where before there had been none. Coyotes watched and did not move. Night fell the way it does when it's earned. He never looked back. The house met them with shade and tin pings cooling. June stood just inside where he'd left her, the horse clenched in one fist, a biscuit gone missing in the other. When she saw her mother's face, some small rope inside her loosened, and for a second she looked what she was little. Cass laid Ruth Ann in his own bed, because there was only one that was worth a body's sleep, and because his brother hadn't died for him to place the living anywhere less. She tried to give him back the room with her mouth, but he shook his head once, the way a man does when the choice made him long before the question arrived. He cleaned her wounds with water, not cool enough, but clean as he could make it. Hands big, movements careful, every touch saying what his mouth never would know knew hurt tonight. June climbed up beside her on the far side, light as a sparrow landing where it knows the branch. She slipped the wood horse onto the pillow and put her head where her mama's shoulder met the bed. The girl watched him work. He did not perform for the watching. Outside, heat unwound into darkness, and the desert sat back on its haunches. Inside, the walls took on the particular quiet that comes when suffering finally meets a hand steady enough to hold it without judgment. Ruth Ann dozed and woke, each time not quite remembering in the first breath where she was. Each time she saw the man by the washstand, his back broad, his profile a cut of mountain and stubborn. Each time she closed her eyes without fear. When she could swallow a little, he fed her broth spoon by spoon. When she drifted into a slant of sleep that might actually rest her, he sat with his hat in his lap and looked at the place where the plaster hadn't held years ago, a crack like a map to somewhere that no one ever got to. He thought of the grave under the Ocotillo 2 miles out, where his brother lay because they had misjudged a river that turned quick when cloudburst took it. He thought of the way silence can be a kindness or a blade. He thought of the girl asleep with a carved horse under her jaw. He did not think of the town, because the town would think of him enough for both of them. Word travels in a desert. There's nothing to soft it. By noon the next day, in the Blue Bottle Saloon, where flies held their meetings over beer, Silas Porter had found a way to be bigger than his smallness. He told the story loud enough that men who didn't give a damn had to hear it. He said his wife was taken by the giant at the Caliche house. Said he knew what kind of bed she was in, and what kind of man Cass McKinnon was when doors shut. Men nodded because nodding costs less than pushing back. Some laughed because laughter is cheap courage. Sheriff Tom Kincaid told Silas to settle, which is a word sheriffs use when the scale is already leaning. Silas sneered. He had the kind of face that made sneers look like it was built for them. He rode out near dusk, not by himself. The desert isn't kind to the lone foolish, but it will carry a pack of them just fine. Cass had hitched the wagon to haul water from the spring below the lava rock, and had brought back a sack of flour and a coil of hope he didn't name. He split wood until the rhythm calmed the desert inside his chest. June trailed his shadow like a second, talking some, not asking much. Ruth Ann sat propped with a pillow, sewing a rip in a shirt that wasn't her making, needle moving like a prayer remembered by the hands before the mouth. "Folks will look," she said when he brought in the water. "Folks always do," he answered. "I've brought you trouble." "Trouble fades slower than shame," he said. "I've had both. I can wait." She looked at the window then, where heat shimmered and the world bent waves around the distance. "He's not a man you can knock sense into," she said. "That's why I don't aim for sense," he said. "I aim for the place he thinks the world can't reach." She didn't ask where that was. She knew. Men like Silas wear their pride outside, and the sun bakes it hard, and they think the crack in it doesn't show. They ate slow, drank water like blessing, let the house learn their sounds. June's eyes did that brave thing children's eyes do when they begin to trust a room not to bite. When the wind shifted, they felt it in the floorboards and in their bones. Sand carries a taste that tells you what the sky intends. The light turned the color of old money. The Ocotillo spines wrote thin black scripture against the west. Cass stood and set the rifle near the jam. "Storm," he said. Ruth Ann's hand found June's hair and smoothed it. The girl's knuckles still held the horse. "He'll come anyway," she said without question. "Maybe," Cass said. He had learned the kind of maybe that doesn't waste breath on hope. The dust came like a memory the land had been dying to tell. A low sound, a long approach, then the horizon went from line to wall. The house sighed and settled, as if deciding which bones to keep from breaking. The cattle nosed into the lee of the rock and turned their rumps to the wind. The air inside the room took on the taste of tin. Then the other sound, hooves through grit. A saddle leather creak too sure of itself. Laughter that didn't carry joy so much as the need to drown something. Cass didn't go for the rifle. Not first. He lifted the lantern, checked the wick, set it near the sill. The storm shouldered the house. The first fist hit the door. "McKinnon," Silas called, voice big as it could get on a little man. "You got what's mine. You've taken what ain't yours." He laughed at his own sentence, like it balanced. June went still as poor light. Ruth Ann's mouth thinned, and the hurt in her eyes shifted into a kind of quiet steel. She stood, swayed, then set a hand to the wall and didn't fall. "Don't you go," she said, looking at Cass, but the words were thinner than the wind. He touched the doorframe with his fingers like a horseman does the neck of a mare before he mounts. He opened the door into the storm. Dust stepped in first, hot and blind. Silas sat his sorrow like a man certain the saddle was all that made him taller. Two others flanked him, men who liked being near meanness because it meant they didn't have to choose their own. "You bring her out," Silas said. "Hat pinned with a Bible pin it hadn't earned. Or I burn out your walls and count your bones." Cass set the lantern on the stoop where the wind might knock it, but where its light would make men honest. He stepped out, closed the door behind him with the soft click of a promise. The dust ran over his shoulders and jumped off like it had burned its feet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The storm would carry it or silence it, either was fine. "She isn't yours to break," he said. Silas smiled like a coyote that didn't know its own ribs. "You think you know what marriage is, giant?" He slurred the last word a little where whiskey had rounded an edge that ought to have stayed sharp. Cass did not answer. Silence is a tool in the hands of a man who's used to hearing it. Silas swung down. He came on quick and messy, dust in his teeth, arms wide like a man, meaning to make the whole world a shove. Cass met him with the patience of a man who has moved stones for fence and knows there is no point rushing weight. He caught the first swing on his shoulder and the next with the heel of his hand and put Silas back on his heels without looking like he was trying to. The other two came because cowards like to be even numbers. Cass didn't swing generous. He placed his fists like posts. Each found earth. When one man clutched his ribs and wheezed, the storm took his breath and didn't give it back right away. Silas fought like shame was snapping at his calves. He found Cass's cheek once, and blood set a small hot line, but it only showed the way a match does in noonlight, useless and bright for nothing. Cass took Silas by the lapels and pressed him to the porch post where his brother's hand had hammered the nail that held the bridle rope hook years back. The post shook like a tree learning wind again. "Kill me," Silas hissed, spittle gathering in the corners. "Make the story fit you." He laughed. It had no music. Giant man, giant rage. Town loves a right-sized tale. Inside the house, June's voice threaded through the dust, small, certain, carrying a mother's name. It hit Cass, in the place Ruth Ann had tried to hold her ribs. He looked at Silas and saw not the man, but the thing pried in a skin suit, reaching for a headline. He let go the distance of a fist and did not take it. "You'll answer," he said, voice lower than the wind could steal. "Not here. Not by me." He turned Silas, half dragged, half drove him to his horse, and put him up with the gracelessness that befits a man not worth gentleness. The others swore and blinked the dust out of eyes that had never seen beyond their own boots. Cass didn't look at them like they were men. He looked past them to the line where the land lifted to the mesa, and the mesa did not move. "Tell Kincaid," he said into the storm, "I'm coming with you in the morning." Silas found a way to smirk even with blood wetting his lip. "You think law's your size," he spat. "No," Cass said, "but conscience fits everybody." "Obo." He stepped back into the house and shut the dust on the outside of the door. The quiet that came wasn't real, but it was close enough to rest on. Ruth Ann stood with her hand still on the wall. She had watched him not take the short road. June ran to him and put her head against his leg because children know which tree doesn't bend wrong in wind. "You could have ended him," Ruth Ann said. "Not a question. A measure. "He's already ending," Cass said. "He just don't know what it looks like." The storm went on until it had said all it meant to. Houses in these places learn to flex, or they learn to fall. This one had been taught by loss to stand. Morning cut the dust to gold. It lay in drifts against the goat pens and in the low places where water never settled anyway. Cass saddled, and Ruth Ann watched him with a look that had more miles in it than she had years. June wound the whittled horse's string around her wrist like a lariat for something she could not name. "You don't owe me more," Ruth Ann said. She meant it. "I know," Cass said. He meant it back. He rode with Silas, slumped ahead of him like a sack that resented being carried. The two who'd come last night fell in, quiet as men who'd learned something they wouldn't talk about. Sheriff Kincaid met them at the jail with a jaw that didn't want to pick a side and eyes that already had. He looked at Ruth Ann's face when she came an hour later. He looked and then tried not to. The town watched because that's what towns do when they're not working. Silas Porter, Kincaid read from a paper that reckoned it was law because he was holding it. "You'll be held for striking your wife, for leaving her in mortal danger, for—" The sheriff cleared his throat at the next line. "And for attempting to incite harm at the McKinnon place." The last words sounded like fence wire pulled tight because the posts didn't line. Silas smiled slow. "Boys," he said to the street more than to anybody, "see? Giant stole a man's property, and now he's the one bringing the law. World's turned funny. Maybe God likes a joke." He cackled like laughter could make it true. Cass's hands wanted one thing. His jaw wanted another. He let them want. He didn't give them. There are forms. There are cells. There's a way small towns pretend they are big enough for everything that happens inside them. Kincaid did what he could. It wasn't all right. It was more right than the desert had expected. After, Cass led his horse by the reins down Main, where shade made people kinder. Men whose hats never came off passed him by with their eyes. Women on porches rolled threads of the story between their fingers, like they were separating burrs from wool. Some looked at Ruth Ann, and pity came too soft, too late. She held herself straight, and did not move the corner of her mouth for any of them. June saw a display of sugar sticks in the window of Bartle's store, and looked like a child looks when life offers something that isn't pain. Cass saw it, and went in, and set a nickel on the counter, and the grocer made a face like the money had carried contagion. Cass's eyes met his, and the grocer's face remembered manners it had forgotten. There is a way to walk a woman down a street so that she is not made smaller by it. Cass found that way without thinking about it. He walked just enough in front to take the eyes that couldn't help themselves. He walked just enough beside to say he wasn't her jailer, and not her owner either. June split the difference, holding her mother's hand with one and the sugar stick with the other, and looking up at both, like a compass, finally got a needle. At the end of town stood the little church someone had pushed upright against wind and weather. The mission woman there, Miss Larkin, had hands that had sewn men back into themselves after Apache nicks and childbirth cuts, and the ache that comes of living this side of the Rio. She looked at Ruth Ann, and saw the ledger in her skin, and did not balance it out loud. "You can stay in the back room a while," she said, "in the shade. We'll mend what we can, and learn to live with what we can't." Ruth Ann looked at Cass then as if to ask permission, and then as if to tell herself she didn't have to. Cass lifted his hat and scratched at where the sweat had dried. "The back room will do better than my front," he said. June looked worried at the idea of rooms not Cass's. He bent to her and tapped the horse. "You'll patrol," he said. "Some places need a small sheriff." She nodded like she'd been sworn in. There are papers to sign when a woman decides her body is not furniture. There are words like annul and petition and witness. Cass made his name where it would hold something of her safe. He did not read the room for who approved. That night, back at the Kalish Rise, the house felt a different kind of empty. The kind that follows after the right thing is done. He lay on a cot he'd thrown up in the storeroom and watched light crawl across the ceiling. He heard close things, the scrape of a mouse, the stretch of wood. He heard far things coyote yips turned to song, the long, low train that never came here but told other people's stories in the distance. In the middle of the night he rose, went to the door, leaned his shoulder against the jamb like he'd lean against an old friend who didn't require talk. The desert was a black sheet pulled taut over what men think matters. He said a name once into it. Not Ruth Ann's, his brother's. A man tells one grief to another, and they look at each other and nod. Days set themselves again. He rode fence. He salted cattle. He took a hammer to a pump that always tried to be difficult. In town, Ruth Ann helped Miss Larkin with whatever needed hands. June learned to carry water without spilling it and to sweep toward the door, not away. Sometimes they stood on the mission steps in late day, and Cass came by with supplies he said the mission was short on because the mission is always short on something. He left them on the bench and tipped his hat and went. Sometimes Ruth Ann said Mr. for him, and sometimes she said nothing, which was more. Tongues went on wagging until they got tired. The desert wore them down, same as it wears everything else. Silas Porter stayed 2 weeks in a cell and came out with eyes that said the lesson was not the one the sheriff had hoped for. Men who count their worth by who fears them don't come out gentled by bars. He found a different bar. This one sold whiskey that made anger feel like a plan. Miss Larkin said a thing in a quiet parlor. "He'll try to make you small again." Ruth Ann nodded like a soldier. Cass felt it in the air the way he had felt the dust storm. It starts as a thought at the edges. Vultures turn a circle farther out than chance. He added a latch to the mission's back door. He took a late ride around town that didn't look like a ride around town. He breathed like a man who's thinking ahead and praying backward. It came on a Wednesday that hadn't decided to be anything. Sun honest, wind lazy. Cass had just set a sack of flour by Miss Larkin's bench. June ran out with the horse in one hand and the other, holding a drawing of 3 lines and a circle that had meant something to her that day. Ruth Ann came to the doorway with a smile that tried to be small and could not. The day had forgiven itself. Then a sound, the particular clatter of a man who wants attention and brings a gun to ask for it. Silas Porter stepped from between 2 buildings like a snake, convinced the world needed to see it. He had whiskey in him and a righteousness that always came with it. His hat sat wrong. Some men you can tell by the way their hats sit. "You," he pointed, and that word meant too many things. At Ruth Ann, at June. At the idea of his own story flattened. "You come back now," he said to Ruth Ann, "and I will let the God part of me forgive what you done." He said it like kindness was a favor he might extend if the price pleased him. Miss Larkin moved to stand in a place that said women make walls even without wood, but Silas's gun moved like a mouth. June pressed herself into Ruth Ann's skirt, and Cass saw the way the small fist whitened around the horse. He stepped in front with a quiet that made the space against the door a canyon. He did not draw. He did not touch the gun. He looked at Silas, and the looking made Silas flinch the way noon makes a drunk blink. "This, the place you want to do your talking?" Cass asked. His voice found the church bell and came back steady. Silas took a step. The muzzle came up. Sheriff Kincaid was somewhere else, as sheriffs often are when a moment asks men who they are. The town held its breath with its back turned, which is another way of watching. "Move," Silas said, and meant the world. "No," Cass said, and meant only himself. The gun came level. Ruth Ann made a sound without volume. June did not cry out, because some children are born into wars small enough to fit in houses. Cass saw the movement in Silas's wrist that said the bullet might go anywhere. He didn't think. The body remembers what the mind decided in other rooms. He stepped through Silas's aim and took him high at the shoulder, and the gun fired wild into heaven, where God has learned to duck. They went down in a knot of dust and hate and long habit. Cass found the gun wrist, and turned it, and heard a crack that meant the gun would not be held that way for a while. Silas screamed the language of a boy who never learned a better one. The gun fell, and Miss Larkin's foot found it, and sent it beneath the mission steps like a snake that had to go back to its hole. Silas swung with his left and found Cass's ear, and a warm thread ran down into the collar. Cass put his forearm at Silas's throat and held him there until the rage kicked itself out like a horse making a last try. He did not choke him, he pinned him to a plain day. "Look," Cass said low, not to Silas but to the small crowd that had gotten brave enough to glance. "Look at what he is with his gun gone." The town did, briefly. You have to make a town see. It won't do it by itself. Kincaid came then, breathing like he'd had to run uphill. He saw the shape of the thing and put his hand on the right side of it. "Silas Porter," he said, and the words were getting practice now. "You're done." Silas spit up into his own face, and it fell back onto his lip, and he didn't wipe it. He looked at Ruth Ann and tried a smile that had hurt all around it. "You'll starve without me," he said. Ruth Ann stood with her hands at her sides and her chin even. "I already did," she said. The words didn't ring. They settled. Kincaid hauled Silas up with help that didn't want to touch him. The cell door closed for a longer time. Cass picked the gun up from where Miss Larkin had towed it and broke it and emptied it and put the pieces on the sheriff's desk without speech. He washed his ear in Miss Larkin's basin while June watched like this was what mornings were. Ruth Ann brought a cloth. He took it and didn't flinch when she touched the edge of a cut. Their eyes met once like a graze, not a wound. "What now?" she asked. "Now," he said. "You live." The word had no poetry. It didn't need any. Week followed week like tracks going forward, because there is nowhere else they can go. The mission had its own clock. Ruth Ann grew color under the skin again, the kind that comes from sleep, not stolen. June found a way to laugh for no reason. Cass worked quiet. Didn't come by every day because salvation done right doesn't hover. When he did, he left things on the bench that no one asked payment for: a sack of beans, a roll of calico, a tin of coffee that made mourning not a duty but a mercy. He fixed the mission's pump. The handle moved smooth after his hand remembered how. He sanded a splinter from the pew that had caught men's coats for 10 years, and no one had cared to fix it. He didn't ask Ruth Ann for anything that smelled like future. He stood in doorways. He tipped his hat. He looked at June the way a man looks at a sunrise he didn't expect to see, grateful and not greedy. Summer leaned hard. The desert baked stories into brief, hard lines. Then a day came when the youngest of Cass's heifers took a bad cut from a rock, and the blood wouldn't stop. He tied it off with a strip of his own shirt, and told the cow she was stubborn like the rest of them, and the cow flicked a fly and said she knew. He worked until the light failed, then rode into town, dusted head to heel. He found the mission yard empty in the late glow. The back door stood open to a room that had learned new silhouettes. On the table lay a folded parcel wrapped in flour sack cloth, tied careful with the kind of knot you don't learn from men. Inside, he found his shirt mended where she'd stitched it true, found a scrap of paper with a line in a hand that wanted to write like it could trust. "Thank you for the way you stood between our." He closed his hand around that paper like it might fly, and he didn't want to chase it across the desert. He stepped out and saw them then, Ruth Ann and June at the pump, water running clean into the bucket, the girl setting her mouth to the stream because that is what joy asks for. Ruth Ann's laugh was small, and not trying to convince anyone of anything. He watched long enough to make a picture that could last. She turned and saw him, and for the first time there was something in her face that wasn't survival. It wasn't gratitude either. It was a quiet that answered his. The kind two people bring to a place and set down together without a word. If this were a different kind of country, that might have been the whole of it. But deserts pare down everything, even wishes. In August, a letter came from a sister Ruth Ann had in Las Cruces, a woman who had married a farrier and had a yard with 3 cottonwoods that remembered rain. It said there was a place for a mother and a child. It said the train to Mesilla ran on Tuesdays and Fridays if the money did what money is supposed to do. Miss Larkin folded the letter with fingers that knew this day would arrive. Ruth Ann held the paper like it might ask her to choose between breath and breath. June stared at the word Mesilla like it was a hill she might run down. Cass came by, and Miss Larkin left them in the shade that lay thin as a scarf over the stoop. They sat on the bench because benches are where decisions get their shoes on. "I can't pay you for what you've done," Ruth Ann said. She was not crying. She was not trying not to. "I didn't put a price on it," Cass said. "If I stay, the town will wear me like a bruise on you." She said it like the weather fact, not drama. "If you go," he said, "the open between sun up and sun down gets wider." They didn't look at each other long. Desert folk learned to be careful with direct light. June chased a lizard along the wall and whispered to it about a far place with 3 trees. She took the horse in hand and made it gallop across the bench, as if to say some things travel if you help them. "You saved me twice," Ruth Ann said at last. "Once from a man, once from a story." He shook his head. "You stood up by yourself. I only stood outside so you had room." She nodded, and the nod had gratitude in it, and respect in it, and something that might have grown into a different word if the land had been kinder. "There's a coach Friday," Miss Larkin said from the doorway. She had the look of a woman who sets bread in an oven and trusts it will rise if left alone. Friday came with a sky white as bone. The stage rumbled dust and apology. Cass stood with their bundle and June's small satchel that had a ribbon in it and a rock she liked the look of. Ruth Ann wore the dress Miss Larkin had unpicked and resewn until it looked like dignity again. The bruise under the skin would not show where the sun could see it. Folks watched from behind curtains because that is apparently a good way to watch. Sheriff Kincaid tipped his hat with a face that said he might be learning the difference between law and right. Cass lifted June to the coach step, and she turned and wrapped her arms around his neck in a way that told him he would remember the weight of it longer than he would remember anything she might ever say. He set her down careful, as if bones were glass. He handed the satchel up, and the driver took it with the rough tenderness. Men learn when they handle lives more often than cargo. Ruth Ann stood very near and very far. She looked up once, as if the desert had a ceiling with an answer on it. She faced him then. If she had a speech, she put it away. "You could ask me to stay," she said quietly. "I won't," he said. "It cost something to say it, and he paid." "Why?" "Because you deserve to choose without owing." The line at the corner of her mouth softened. "You deserve somebody choosing you," he almost smiled. "Desert's done a good job of that. It chose me long before I knew I had a say." "Lee." She reached up and put her palm briefly against his cheek where the scar from Silas's ring had healed thin. It was not a caress, it was a benediction, a way of saying, "I see the man you became on the nights nobody watched." She stepped into the coach then, and June slid over and made a space like children do when they still believe spaces can be made. The door shut, the driver clucked to the team, the wheels moved, dust rose and hung. And in that dust the image of a man and a woman and a child took longer than the coach to leave. Cass stood, as if staying were a job. He did not lift his hand. He had never been the waving kind. When the coach turned beyond the livery and was gone, the street closed around the absence. He walked to his horse and put his hand where the withers meet the neck, the place animals like to know you remembered. He swung up. He rode out toward the Kalish rise. He did not turn around. Evenings got quiet again, but not the old kind. Silence can be a shroud or a quilt. This one covered without suffocating. He cooked when he remembered. He drank coffee that had been made with purpose. He fixed the hinge on the shed door that had an off-kilter squeal. He wrote a letter he wouldn't send to a sister in Masilla he didn't know, telling her that the girl liked ribbon and rocks and the horse that could patrol a mission yard, that the mother liked the edges of things to be squared and the truth not to be a knife unless it needed to. He put the letter in a drawer because a man doesn't send everything he writes. The desert settled back into the man-shaped place it had made. It looked different from the inside. Once, months on, a dust devil spun itself into being across the wash and flared out like a spirit that had remembered something and then forgotten. Cass watched it and said out loud, "She's safe." It wasn't a question. He rode to the little rise where his brother lay and sat with his hat off and the sun honest. He told the stone nothing. He told the wind everything. In the next town over, someone asked Sheriff Kincaid why the giant up north didn't marry. Kincaid said, "He's already promised," and didn't explain what to. Maybe the mesa, maybe his own word, maybe to the idea that a man could carry somebody as far as the safe place and set them down without claiming credit, and that this counted more than gold. When the first rain in too long ghosted the desert, the smell lifted from the ground and hung like recollection. Cass stood in the doorway and let it move through him. He thought of a girl with a carved horse and a woman who stitched truth into old cloth. He thought of a coach turning where the street gives up and the errand of the heart keeps going. He slept long that night. He woke before dawn anyway. Men like him don't change clocks. He saddled and rode out where the cattle pushed dew into dirt, and the horizon was a promise no man could own. The wind carried her name long after he stopped saying it. Silence wasn't punishment, it was peace. And yet, when the season turned, the land seemed to remember the shape of her. The cottonwoods down the wash leafed sooner than they should have. The sand verbena bloomed in places that had been hardpan for years. Cass noticed and didn't call it meaning, but he noticed all the same. He kept his chores, same as before, fixing a gate that didn't ask for fixing, tightening wire that would have held another year. At night he'd sit on the porch, coffee cooling, the sky opening wide enough to swallow any man's regret. Coyotes sang in the low country, and sometimes their voices braided into something soft, something almost like laughter. Once, he found a scrap of blue ribbon caught on a mesquite thorn. Could have been anyone's, but the way it fluttered, gentle, determined, made him stop. He untangled it, rolled it between his fingers, then tied it to the bridle ring on his saddle horn. It stayed there, fading to the same color as sky just before dawn. He never took it off. Years would pass that way, counted not by calendars but by the slow mercy of small things, the scent of rain on caliche, the creak of his brother's old chair, the rustle of grass reborn where dust had ruled. When riders came through, they'd say the man up on Caliche Rise kept to himself but was fair, never turned away the thirsty, never raised his hand in anger. Some said he'd once stood down a storm with nothing but his will. Others said he was waiting for something, though they couldn't say what. Cass never corrected them. At sunset, he'd ride to the ridge where the light broke itself on stone. From there he could see the far country, a haze of gold and ghost. He'd tip his hat to no one in particular and sit till the shadows stretched long enough to take his shape. When the last edge of sun slipped under the horizon, he'd say one word, low as dust, "Safe." Then he'd turn home, slow and steady, the ribbon whispering against leather, the wind carrying everything that didn't need to be spoken. And the desert, faithful and unjudging, carried it back to her in its own way. "I have to marry my cowboy friend's widow or lose the ranch to thieves." In the merciless sun of Red Creek, Colorado, circa 1875, the air hung heavy and still, thick with the shimmering heat that clung to the baked earth. A gust of wind, a rare event, only served to whip up a stinging cloud of dust, making the world a canvas of oppressive red and brown. This was a land that bred solitude and demanded a certain kind of toughness, a truth etched into the landscape and mirrored in the face of a lone man. Elias, a figure of silent endurance, stood at the edge of his property. His worn-out boots were caked in the same clay that covered the cracked expanse of the ranch, his faded jeans and patched denim jacket, a uniform of a life lived by the land's unyielding rules. A man of few words, his conversations were with the cattle, the rusted machinery, and the fence posts he hammered into the ground with relentless precision. He was a man defined not by the people he knew, but by the work he did alone. Just as the sun began its descent, bleeding a weak orange across the sky, Elias, seated on his dusty porch, carefully sharpened a hunting knife, his movements methodical and practiced. He was just a ghost, an echo in the quiet canyon. Suddenly, a sound tore through the silence, a cry, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was a child's cry, thin with desperation, a sound utterly alien to this harsh, barren land. The cry came from the north, from the treacherous, winding path that cut through the canyons. The noise shattered the peace and the loneliness that Elias had long cultivated, a sharp intrusion into his predictable world. He froze, his calloused hand tightening on the knife hilt. The calm he lived by, the isolation he had built, now felt fragile. He had a choice to make, a clear line drawn in the dust before him. Ignore the sound and maintain his solitary peace, or respond to a call that promised only trouble and entanglement. Without a moment of hesitation, he rose to his feet, a heavy responsibility settling on his shoulders. He walked with a determined stride toward the canyon, his feet kicking up dust with every step. The child's cry, though weak, was an iron hook pulling him forward, forcing him to confront a world he had so carefully avoided. He was no hero, no rescuer, but something in the desperate sound would not let him stay where he was. He was moving, and with every step, the story of his solitary life was beginning to turn on a new page. He had to go. The funeral took place on a hot afternoon, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt road leading up to the small cemetery. A few cottonwoods stood along the fence line, their branches hardly moving, offering little shade for the